Mon père fait bâtir maison, chante la moulette la pépéture à trois pignons, chante la moulette, chante la moulette, la pépéture à trois pignons, chante la moulette, sur toi chantier qui.
So I'm going to tell you the story of the whole cemetery. This was opened in 1787. There was a big flood in 1785. It was a real big one, and so they moved the town all the way up here. The King of Spain gave a land grant for this parcel of land from Market up to Jefferson, and from 5th all the way up to 6th. And he gave it to the Roman Catholic citizens of St. Genevieve, which by the 1990s it was who owns the cemetery. So at that point, well, let me go on. And so they brought people in, and everybody was buried here. Not just the Roman Catholic citizens. There were Protestants buried here. There were French. There were Germans. There were slaves. There were Indians that are buried here. We had, though their markers are gone, but they're buried in the swale back there. They were a lot of times the slave owners would have their slaves buried around them, and sometimes not. So you can't say, well, I'm going to go by this tomb and say that all are here. So we don't have a exclusive way of saying this is how it goes. But they were French and they were German. So you see French tombstones and German tombstones, a few English as it went on, and I found one Latin gravestone. So you can look and see what you can find in that map. So the tombstone opened in 1787, and by 1882, every time they tried, there's no map of this. In modern tombstones, you go in and you say, I'm looking for my great-grandma, and they pull out a map and they go, oh, she's buried right here. Go 3 streets down, make a right, and the 4th tombstone she's in. That's not how this works. They just came in, somebody died, and they said, I think there's a spot over there that nobody is buried in. And they would dig down and find out if there was a spot nobody was buried in. And it was all good. But by 1882, every time they dug down, they were like, oh, somebody's buried here, somebody's buried here, and somebody's buried here. So by 1882, they thought that every grave had been used. And so they closed the cemetery because there were a lot of cholera epidemic victims that were buried here, and they were not sure that that cholera wouldn't come out and start another epidemic. And so they closed the cemetery in 1882. Now you would think that meant the last person buried here is in 1882, but not so. The last person buried here was in 1894. And so you'll meet her, and she'll tell you all about that. But we also want to say, just a second, please. Everything is beeping at me. So she's the last person that's buried here until I die, because I have a spot picked out up in the corner. We'll see, Come back. One of these years, somebody else will be telling this and saying, and then there's this crazy lady that got buried later. But anyway, it is a closed cemetery. It is used by every nationality, every religion, every type of person that was around during that 100 years or so. It is unique in that way. Most cemeteries are either the city cemetery that is generally the poor, or they are the religion. So all of the Methodists are buried here. All of the Catholics are buried in this cemetery. All of the Baptists are buried in their cemetery. But in this case, it's not so. I'm going to tell you one story because Senator Lynn could not be here tonight, and he was the U.S. senator from the state of Missouri. He was very, very effective, and he was off to Washington, back and forth. And when he died, he was buried here. The state of Missouri buried him up on the hill up there. And I'm only going to tell you about his burials, many as they were. And in 1905, after the cemetery had been closed, people were writing into the newspaper about how terrible the cemetery was. That pigs were wallowing on the graves of our ancestors. And so there was so much more commotion about the animals that coming in and using this as a stomping ground. So the state of Missouri dug up Senator Lynn and moved he and his wife out to the new cemetery. So they got people interested, and they made this a little bit nicer, took charge of things, and by 1924 they had really made it a lot nicer. And by 1935 there was a WPA grant that put a fence completely around the cemetery, keeping the pigs and the cows out. So the state of Missouri said, could you please bring Senator Lynn back? So they dug Senator Lynn and his wife up. He was in a lead coffin that had a glass viewing plate in it and a lead door over the top, but the lead door came off. And so you could look in and see Senator Lynn. And so they very quickly, the priest and all of the altar boys came up, and they brought everybody, school-age children from kindergarten on up, all came up in order to see him, so that those small children could say, I saw Senator Lynn, even though he was buried 100 years ago for the first time. So, and for years, I couldn't tell this story to a group like this without somebody raising their hand saying, I saw Senator Lynn. Did anybody in this group? No? Okay. So they did a really lovely burial cemetery. They had all the altar boys in their lace chasubles, and they came in and they really did a nice burial back into his original grave, which is, if you go up to the top of the hill, you'll see an obelisk with a knob on the top and 3/4 of a fence around it. We need to replace that fence. So after it was all finished, all of the school children went back to school, and everybody thought it was really nice that Father had come out, brought the altar boys, and lest you take into it that Senator Lynn was a Methodist.
Oh, wow.
Not a Catholic, but he is here, and he's going to stay here, and we hope nobody has to dig him out. They have concrete at the top of it, so he's here to stay. So I don't want to keep you from seeing all of the spirits that are here, and it's great.
Wonderful.
Oh, you're welcome.
Madame, comment ça va?
Not at all.
How are you? How are you? Je m'appelle Martin Aubuchon. My name is Martin Aubuchon. I am actually a descendant of one of the original Aubuchons from this town, Antoine Aubuchon. He was on the 1752 census of this town. But actually, he's not buried in this cemetery. So they suspect he was in the original cemetery that was in where the original town was, down there in the floodplain. And as you know, or may not know, there was a flood. There was a great flood after the town was established in 1735, 1750. That's a debate for the historians. But anyway, after there was a big flood, and then they decided to move the town more inward to higher ground. But this is still subject to flooding. But anyway, so tonight I'm just going to talk about a little bit of Aubuchon there, and also share with you a major event that happened in this town in 1773. But before I get in that, but Antoine originally came he was originally born in Montreal, and then migrated down to Kaskaskia, across the river, where he joined three brothers, and then at some point in time, in 1750s, he crossed the river here. So we know he's here in 1752. But originally they were farmers, and like most of the people in this town. But he does appear. No, his son Antoine Jr. and his son Antoine Twamish III. They are part of the 1780 militia records.
Okay.
But so that's kind of the background, and then none of my forefathers, basically, I should say in my line, they all migrated westward to French Village and Aux Mines, but there's a lot of us in this town anyway. So that's enough of that. But I will share with you an event that did happen in this town in 1773. And we know of the event that actually involved, it was a murder trial. And what was unique about this event, it was a civilian investigation and also a military investigation. And there was a author by the name of Carl Eckert that found the records in St. Genevieve records here, but he also found the military records over in Seville, Spain, and they correlate, so we know this event. Anyway, there was a Métis hunter by the name of Celadon, and Métis means he's mixed blood. So he come into town. Oh, before I get up, in 1773. We know St. Genevieve was a French town, but who controlled this territory? What government? Spain, absolutely, because the French were fighting the British over land, and the French lost. So, with the Treaty of Paris, they gave all their land to the Britain on the east side of the river, and on the west side they gave it to Spain. So this was under Spanish control. So there was actually a Spanish regiment here, commanded by Commandant Lieutenant Villers. The Spanish regiment was about 9, and the French militia was about 180 people. But anyway, I got off sidetrack here a little bit. So Celadon, the French hunter, or mixed breed hunter, comes into town. And while he was here, he strikes up a relationship with Corporal Oliver, which was with the Spanish Louisiana Regiment. And he's also making friends with Marguerite Vallée. And Marguerite Vallée is an Indian slave owned by Elizabeth, the widow of Antoine. So anyway, so he's in town and that then, but he had a desire to find a mate. He needed somebody to go back out into the. He wanted somebody to go back into the woods and share his life. So anyway, he's trying to court Mary Ann. Mary Ann says no. Basically I have nothing to do with you. But at one time, Mary Ann with Corporal Oliver, forget the other Corporal Oliver, and Celadon, and then another individual. They decide they want to. This is Sunday evening. They decide let's have a little party. We need some of that. So they cross the river, go over to Kaskaskia, and along with some other people, and they're basically socializing, have a party. While he's over at Kaskaskia, there was another Indian slave, which we'll call Madam X, because we don't know her name. Anyway, apparently he's striking up a relationship with her too. And this enters in later too. So anyway, while this is all going out, at some point in time, Celadon crosses the river, still borrows a canoe, crosses the river, and goes to the house and talks to Madam X, and coming back with him and in the dark, and leaves her at night down near a campground down near Saline Creek, down in that area. So that's happening. But then the owner of her, he goes to the British government over in Kaskaskia and reports that his slave is missing. So the British government sends a attaché across the river, reports to Francois Vallée that I'm missing a slave. So Francois Vallée, the commandant here, sends out a posse looking for her. And it was headed up by an Indian guide. They ultimately find Celadon's trail, and they end up finding the body of Madam X. And she had been shot. So they bring her back in town. There was a doctor. He does a little autopsy investigation, and they find that she had been shot. Actually shot from up in the upper chest, and then in the exit in the back. So that sends. So immediately, the Spanish commandant, Lieutenant Villers, civilian commandant Francois Vallée, they basically overreact. They start putting people in, irons and everything, and then realize we need to do an investigation. And the reason why Corporal Oliver was involved, because there was a friendship between Celadon and Corporal Oliver's. So they thought, well, maybe we need to investigate. You never know. There's all on collusion. Anyway, and so they sent out a posse looking for Celadon to try to bring him back in, put him, investigate. And then at the same time, they put Mary Ann, because they knew that Celadon, they were developing that thing. So anyway, like I said, it was a big investigation. They put her in chains, and but she also had two sons, John Baptiste and Louis, and so they allow her to stay at her house, at the quarters where Elizabeth Aubuchon. And so it was a big investigation. So they're out, posses are out trying to look for Celadon. At the same time, they're having these hearings, investigations. They never did find Celadon. He did sneak into town. We do know he snuck into town, and after about a half hour, he leaves. But while this is going on, they're doing the investigations. They question a lot of people that know Celadon, fellow hunters. They question merchants. They question Mary Ann, who's still in chains, and ultimately. Okay, and then while this is going on, Celadon sneaks back into town, goes to that residence of Elizabeth Aubuchon, and goes in the back of the house and starts trying to convince Mary Ann to leave with him again, and she consents. So she leaves that night, and we do know some of the transcripts, some of the conversations, because her son Jean Baptiste overheard some of the conversations. And at that night, she actually wanted to bring John Baptiste Vallée with her, but John Baptiste, older brother, said, "I will not leave my younger brother Louis." And then she said, "Well, he'll brother miss me." And John Baptiste says, "I'll leave." Well, anyway, Celadon, Mary Ann, they leave. And while this also going, the investigation still continues. They have questioned hunters, and they all testified basically that Celadon had a hair-trigger rifle. So it's quite possible that she was accidentally shot. and the fact of the angles and everything. So the conclusion of the trial was a rule. Francois Valet rules it accidental death. Accidental death, because there's no there, because there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that indicate that it was. But they do know, they hear from the whereabouts of, say, the Dome of Marianne, because they were camped over near Lesterville on the Black River. Yeah, not that far. And they do know that the existence, because hunters would still come into town, talk about get supplies, and so they talk about that. However, the only thing they did rule, Celadon technically was guilty of stealing property. She was slave. However, the Spanish government didn't actually condone, because they didn't like slavery. They liked slavery. So we did hear that Celadon said, "Okay, I'm willing to reimburse Elizabeth for the pride, for the money and everything," but basically it just kind of went away. And but then also, whenever hunters would ever approach Marianne, she'd always ask about the children and if were they being raised properly and were they getting a good Christian education. So, and this happened in 1773, and we have the records. Right. Yes. Any questions?
Good evening. Hello, my name is Genevieve Schwab, and I died during the cholera epidemic of 1857. I was 30 years of age when I passed, and that was a woman well past her prime. At the age of 39, most women in Missouri had passed. I was a school teacher here in St. Genevieve, and I never married. If I'd have married, I could no longer teach school. That was the law in the country at that time. Part of my contract was room and board, which meant usually I lived with the families whose children were coming to school. The more children you sent, the longer I stayed at your house. And usually I walked to school along with your children. Very few people had an extra horse or a carriage or a buggy for me to use. Cholera was a disease that took approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the town when the epidemic passed through between 1854 and 1857. And cholera was a disease that was transmitted through the water. Most people bringing water into their homes at that time were doing so in a bucket. Quite often from a nearby creek, stream, even the Gabaree just on the other side of the trees over there. And most people were doing so with a bucket that they had made themselves, usually out of oak or some other wood. Now, a wooden bucket full of water sitting inside in the summer in Missouri, and everyone's using that same dipper or ladle to drink from. It is nothing but a constant germ infestation. Cholera was a disease that took people quickly. Most people succumbed within 3 days. And it was sometimes called the sinking disease, because one of the symptoms was you were incredibly tired and weak and you would sink down. But you also were incredibly thirsty all the time. So what did you do? You drank more water. By day 2, most people struggled to raise their head off the bed, and by day 3, many were being carried out the door. The day that Genevieve Schwab was buried here, there were 39 buried. All had cholera listed as the cause of death. We're not exactly sure where she's buried, but we do know that they did not do mass graves. They had wooden crosses, so most of those are deteriorated. So.
Short life.
Yeah. Yes.
Short life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for coming. Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hi.
We've joined since you're 30.
Very good. Good luck. I'm Barbara Oakenfoos, and I represent the Germans buried in the cemetery. I have 4 little girls who are buried here. 2, 3, 4 years old, but that was pretty common back then. We didn't know grabbing a bucket of water to drink out of the creek could make you sick. But here's my story. The Germans came to St. Genevieve for a better life. They had a better opportunity to find good farmland here. A man named Godfrey Duden, back in the 1820s, was from Germany, but he lived in west of St. Louis for a while. When he went back to Germany, he wrote a book saying Missouri is the perfect place to come to. You have much better economic opportunity back here. The rolling hills remind you of you're back at home. It's just like in Germany, but in a better place. And thousands of Germans came. They came up the Mississippi. Some settled in this area, St. Louis, Herman. In his book, he even said, don't stop in Arkansas. The tropics down there are miserable. And don't go further than Missouri because the winters are so bitter your cows won't be able to find food to forage. He didn't happen to mention that we have both the hot and the cold here in Missouri, but some people came in hordes. You know, St. Genevieve was established by the French in the mid-1700s, but in the mid-1800s, the Germans came and outnumbered the French by far. I came over as a teenager with my parents, and that was in 1842. A couple of years later, my husband came over. His uncle had paid his way to come over. We were married. Besides our 4 girls that were buried here, we had 3 sons in town who were successful businessmen. You see that red tin roof over there? Uh-huh. One of my sons was a tinsmith. He put the tin roofs on the houses around town. Another was a carpenter, and he advertised that he could make you a coffin for delivery real quickly if you needed it.
Oh,
I am not buried in this cemetery because I lived to be 90 years old. I outlived 7 of my 11 children. I'm buried across town in the new cemetery. So that's a little background on the Germans that are here in St. James. You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Miss McGill, and I am a proud son of the South. In fact, not much is known about me except I died June 22, 1844, 33 years of age, and I was a native of Killybegs, Ireland. Don't know if I was married, don't know if I had any kids, legitimate or otherwise. The thing that I'm proud of is I am a native of Killybegs, Ireland. So Killybegs, Ireland is in County Donegal, which is just south of Northern Ireland, just south of Ulster, and it was a hotbed of Catholic resistance to British rule in the 19th century. In 1790, Wolfe Tone, I love that name, they revolted against British rule in Donegal and all over Ireland, but primarily in the northern part, and he got some rights, but not a lot. And then around 1800, this guy named Napoleon Bonaparte was scaring the bejesus out of the King of England, and they needed soldiers, and the Irish made good soldiers. But you had to renounce Catholicism to become a soldier, until the Prime Minister got a bill through Parliament that said, no, you can stay Catholic as long as you're willing to fight for the crown. And so that was the start of Irish emancipation. And around the time that I was about 10, 15, there was another uprising by a man named Daniel O'Connell. Some of you may have eaten at O'Connell's restaurant up in St. Louis. It's on Kings Highway, I believe. Great hamburgers. That's the Daniel O'Connell. And he fought, and basically after the Napoleonic Wars, the Duke of Wellington, who's the guy who beat Napoleon, said, let's give our Catholic soldiers their rights. Let's give the Catholics rights. They can own land. They can vote for members of Parliament. You still have to basically swear an oath to the king to sit in Parliament, but you could go ahead and do that. So if I came, we don't know when I came to the United States, but if it was before the 1830s, it probably was up through New Orleans because these tall mountains, the Appalachians, would have impeded me. If it was after the 1830s, it would probably have been from one of the big cities on the East Coast, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, because they had the Erie Canal and they were crossing the Appalachians more easily. The thing that amazes me, though, is and I never remember if I've said this yet, but this was a monument erected by the shopmates of the deceased. I was a stonemason. You see the high and mighty with these pillars here. You don't see a working man here. And my shopmates carved their names. I have this handy device here, but you can see their names up there on the top. So,
Oh, wow.
and they carve them in their own tools, and they're different, and none of them are big St. John names. They're all people who I have no idea who they are. I'm not aware of the William Dukes family in St. Genevieve. So those were my shopmates. And I don't know, I mean, I think the people I work with like me. I don't think they like me.
They did a
I don't
great job.
I don't think they like me like this.
Look how it lasted.
But the other thing that I think is interesting, the other thing about the craftsmanship of this is a separate piece. So these things here are separate from this block, So, I mean, they're very heavy. They're not going anywhere. But it was a separate piece. So around the time that I died, 1844, the Germans were coming in. And stonemasonry was going out of style as a construction method. You had Irish stonemasons built the old old academy building on top of the hill. They built the stone church. They built the stone cathedral up in St. Louis. But the Germans loved their brick. It was cheaper. You could do fancier things with it. And so stonemasons had to do different things. And one of them was building fabulous tombstones for the Victorians, who thought that it was for some reason important to have a huge tombstone once you died and went to heaven or hell. So I think this was advertising. I think this was both my workers liked me, and they also wanted the good people of St. Genevieve to know, you want a nice tombstone, call A. LaGrave and Company, and we would be more than happy to put something over your dead body. Oh. And nobody knows how I died. I died young. And I want to just point out this fellow over here. I don't know if there's a connection between these two. There's no name on this. There's nothing on this. There might have been something up on top. But in the era of these cemeteries, a pillar that was broken was a sign of a tragic early death. Not an infant death, but it basically meant a life that was broken at a young age. I was 33, which doesn't make me super young in 1844, but I'm still pretty young. It's not like a 33-year-old dying now, which would be a tragedy. But so I don't know if there's a connection. You also see all these Masonic tools up here. There's a T-square, there's a compass, all of these tools. A lot of people ask, so was he a Mason? Was he a member of a Masonic lodge? The short answer is probably not, because the Catholic Church and the Masons did not get along at all. But St. Genevieve was the first town that had a Masonic lodge west of the Mississippi. And if you look at, and that was 1806, so just 3 years after the Louisiana Purchase. And you will see a lot of French names from prominent families on the original charter. So on the frontier, the French, who knew the Americans were the wave of the future and wanted to get in on their business, would join the Masonic Lodge and still remain Catholic. By 1844, I don't think they were doing that anymore. Until the 1980s, it was grounds for excommunication if you were a Catholic and a Mason. Oh, wow. And I just don't think that the Dennis McGill, this stonemason, had enough clout to get a spot in the Catholic Church and also be a member of the Masonic Lodge. So I don't know if there's any connection. So the final thing is my theory. The thing I like about Dennis McGill is I can make things up. I could say anything I wanted. I try not to. But I kind of think everything so far has been 85% true. But I think he probably died on the job. Because I think the only way my shopmates would do anything like this for me is if I was a good worker, but I died on the job. So that's my theory. So when you go around here and see all the rosiers and the valleys and those highfalutin types, remember the best tombstone here is the Irish ones.
Wow.
Okay?
So are you the only Irish person that they've identified so far?
I don't know, but I'm the only one who brags about being from
Okay,
Ireland.
all right.
So I mean, so thanks for coming. But I'll
You
start
guys
my
from St. Jen or from the area?
Yes,
Okay.
Well, good evening. Thank you for joining us. So tonight you've seen a lot of tombstones of many people buried here. But there are many, many people buried here who have no stone to mark their grave. We represent some of those people. In particular, we represent a group of people that suffered in a terrible tragedy just 4 miles north of here near Turkey Island on the Mississippi River.
It was Sunday, August 22nd, in the year of our Lord, 1852. My wife and I had just become new grandparents, and so we decided to make the trip from St. Louis all the way to Louisville to meet our new grandson, who had just been born a couple of months prior. We decided to make that trip by steamboat. So we purchased tickets to board the Dr. Franklin II, which I thought to myself at the time was a rather odd name for a boat. Wouldn't you agree?
It was about 2 p.m. when we set sail that day.
Captain Harkins.
Captain Harkins. Yeah, he couldn't join us because he was sick, which worked out better for him. But Mr. Montgomery, his clerk, he told us that the boat had only been built 4 years earlier in 1848 in West Virginia.
The Dr. Franklin II averaged a speed of only about 7 miles an hour, and so while it was definitely not a fast way to travel, it was still a lot smoother ride than going all the way to Louisville on horseback. So needless to say, we had a lot of time to meet our fellow passengers.
One of those was a famous author by the name of Ned Buntline. Have you ever heard of him? Well, he used to write these dime novels, and I'll have to be honest, I never read any of them. But he told the most outlandish story one evening.
He told us that he had single-handedly captured 2 murderous villains with his own bare hands and had received a $600 reward.
We didn't know if that was true or if it was just another one of his stories.
As we slowly made our way down the river, the sun began to set, so we decided that we would spend the evening up on the deck watching the sunset and the scenery pass by. It was a lot cooler than going back to our cabin. It was August in Missouri, after all.
Little did we know that that decision would cost us our lives. About 11 p.m. that night, we were getting ready to pull into St. Genevieve when the flue on the starboard side of the boat collapsed, and being a steamboat, it released a large amount of steam. And it scalded us, along with about 40 other passengers and crew that happened to be on deck that evening.
Our boat was towed into St. Genevieve, where the local residents would witness a horrific scene of dead and dying passengers. Our bodies were brought here to this cemetery and buried in a mass grave right here where you're standing.
After the accident, they towed the Dr. Franklin to St. Louis and disposed of it by setting it on fire.
And even though the stone that once marked our graves has been gone and long forgotten, as is the case with many of the graves in this cemetery, we hope that our story will not be forgotten. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Wow.
So I'm John Scott. I'm the Missouri's first congressman, and I was born in 1782 in Virginia. My family moved to Vincennes, Indiana, and then I studied at Princeton University and got my law degree there, and then moved to St. Genevieve and set up my law practice here. And that was in the early 1800s. I was known as a brave and honest man. I was loved by many in the community, and I had tremendous influence with the jury because I once defended a gentleman that he was guilty. Everybody knew he was guilty. The evidence pointed to the fact that he was guilty, but when the jury came back, they said not guilty. The judge said, "How can you say he's not guilty?" And they said, "Well, didn't John Scott ask us to come back with a verdict of not guilty?" So when Missouri became a territory, I was appointed as Missouri's first U.S. attorney to the territory of Missouri. I was a little bit eccentric. I wore a carved dagger around my neck, even in the courtroom, and I also carried a pistol. I wasn't afraid of a duel because of a newspaper article that was written that wasn't too kind. I once challenged 5 guys to a duel before breakfast, and they all backed down, so it didn't happen. But there was a duel in St. Genevieve between Thomas Crittenden and Dr. Walter Fenwick. And Dr. Fenwick lived in the house right at the corner of the cemetery there with the green roof, because you can't see it anymore because it's too dark, but the little house that sits on the corner there. And but the argument was between Dr. Fenwick's brother and Thomas Crittenden. So they had an argument, and they decided to settle it by a duel, but it was Dr. Fenwick that took up for his brother. So it was between Thomas Crittenden and Dr. Fenwick. Well, I was the second of Thomas Crittenden, which meant that if he wasn't able to go, I was the one that was going to pull the trigger. Other than that, I was the witness for it. Well, Dr. Fenwick was a better doctor than he was a marksman, and he didn't survive. So I got married in 1810. My first wife was Catherine. And then in 1815, I actually lost her in childbirth. And then 2 months later, I lost my 5-year-old daughter as well. There was a lot of cholera going around at that time. So I became kind of a recluse, but I continued my law practice until the following year. And in 1816, I put my law practice on hold and started my political career. And my first election was with a gentleman by the name of Rufus Easton. It was a close, contested race. I was actually losing by 7 votes the night of the election, but there was still one precinct to come in from St. Louis. And it came in, but it came in by horseback and came in overnight, but I was declared the winner by 7 votes. So I decided I had to pick up and travel to Washington, D.C. Well, I wore oversized clothes, coat. I carried my green legal bag with me, but I traveled by horseback. From St. Genevieve to, my whole political career, I traveled by horseback from St. Genevieve to Washington, D.C. I was known as a very honest man, that if anybody had any dealings with anybody there, they would give me money to make that transaction and bring back whatever. So I had a good reputation that way. But when I did get to Washington, D.C., Rufus Easton had been there already before me and said the election was sour. And so Congress decided, they debated about what to do, and what they decided to do was declare Missouri's seat empty for the time being and send us both back to Missouri to redo the election. Well, in the meantime, I'd become more popular, and I actually won the second election by 400 votes. So, and I was reelected 4 different times to Missouri. I was very passionate about helping Missouri become a state. I helped co-author the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which allowed Missouri to come in as a slave state and Maine to come in as a free state in order to keep the balance equal. And then I was very excited when I fought very hard for Missouri to become a state, and of course it became a state in 1821. I was also very passionate about public education and fought for part of the Missouri Constitution that I wrote to acquire land for public education, actually established Missouri's first university. I was also on the Board of Regents for the academy up on the hill there. It was the first secondary education facility in Missouri. So as I say, I pretty much voted the will of the people my whole political career. And 1824 was my last successful election. In 1826, I kind of went the other direction. That was the year that Andrew Jackson was up for president, and I didn't feel that a soldier should be in the White House, so I voted for John Quincy Adams instead. That cost me an election, my local election as well, and so that ended my political career. I came back to St. Genevieve and continued my law practice at that time. Now, if anybody's either from St. Genevieve here or is familiar with some of our traditions, we have a deal at New Year's Eve time. It's called Lagione. Okay, Well, at one time, the city fathers said, can't do that anymore. Outlawed. Well, there's a bunch of Frenchmen that decided they couldn't go listen to that. They're going to have Lagione anyway. So they did, and they got arrested. So they got thrown into court, and I was brought in to represent them. And I said, well, I don't see the problem here. I said, they didn't disturb the peace. Nobody got hurt. And I said, besides, what they did was protected by the Bill of Rights. Well, I don't know if there was or not, but nobody questioned me on it. So they declared him not guilty. We all went to the tavern and celebrated.
Start singing Lagani.
Yeah. So as I came to the end of my life, at one point I bolted up in bed, grabbed my revolver, and said, "Show me the man that wants to destroy this government, and I'll do him in." And somebody asked me as I was nearing the end of my life that isn't it time that you get religion, because I pretty much was a cusser and everything, and I said, I've served the devil all my life. I don't see any need to disappoint him now. So.
So I am Jean Ferdinand Rosier.
Okay.
I was born in Nantes, France. Rosier, you have trouble with the name. Perhaps if I said Roger, it would be more familiar to some. In fact, you see the Roger name all over Saint Genevieve. On the street, there's a Roger's Country Mart. There was a Roger's store. My descendants, if you know any Rogers in Saint Genevieve, Perry County, St. Francis County, Jefferson County, St. Louis County, more than likely they are descendants of mine. Like I say, I was born in Nantes, France in 1777, so you wonder, how is it that I came to this country, to this specific place here, Saint Genevieve? It is an interesting story, and it is a result of the fact that my father and his business partner, Captain Audubon, thought it best to send their sons to the New World, in part to avoid conscription into Napoleon's army at the time. Also because the Louisiana territory had just been opened 2 years prior. And so they, being business partners in Nantes, France, thought it a good idea to send their young sons, 25 and 21 years old basically, to this new country and have them explore business possibilities, possibly with the end result of having some trade between our company here in the United States and their businesses in Nantes, France. But before we get started on that, we must first check on Captain Audubon's property in Pennsylvania, Mill Grove, which had been managed by a Mr. DeCosta for some years. And Captain Audubon had funneled funds into Mill Grove, had even approached my father for funds to funnel into Mill Grove because there was the potential prospects that there might be some mining possibilities on the actual property. So one thing that our fathers wanted us to do was to go to Mill Grove and examine the real possibilities of this mining enterprise there, and also see how DeCosta had been managing it. Well, as you can imagine, two youngsters showing up in their father's name to discuss with Mr. DeCosta how he's running the business and asking him to open his books and allow us to see how he's been doing things, it was not well received. And we personally did not care to deal with him or the situation because, honestly, much of the East Coast enterprises were already so well established. And we had explored this possibility of this new country here, the Upper Louisiana Territory, being a good potential for some new frontier expansion and growth area. So that was the idea. And we took the funds that we had made after selling out to DeCosta and used it to purchase items to bring with us. We explored the Ohio River Valley, Louisville, other sites, Henderson, Kentucky, even and considered all these possibilities. But when we learn of St. Genevieve, the largest town, 1,400 people in this upper Louisiana territory, as having 5 mercantile stores in it, we think this is perhaps a good opportunity. So while in Kentucky, we buy as much whiskey as we could manage, 300 barrels of it at 25 cents a gallon, and loaded it onto flatboats. Unfortunately, we got held up by a blizzard in December of 1810 down at the mouth, the conjunction of the Ohio River and the Mississippi, around the general area of Cairo, Illinois, if you know that territory. It was the longest winter I have spent in my life. Here we are, sitting on 300 barrels of whiskey and gunpowder and other merchandise, just waiting to establish a mercantile trade 80 miles upriver on the Mississippi here. When we finally arrive here in February of 1811, I am overjoyed. Finally, we can sell. But not only this, they speak French here. I'm speaking my own native language. I've had trouble with your English up to this point, all this time down the Ohio. Audubon, he's somewhat better, but he's younger too. And that time with him that winter blizzard was almost too much for me to take, because I am a businessman. I want to get on with what we came here. It's already been 5 years that we have been struggling, trying to establish and find a place, and finally, St. Genevieve is it. I know it is it. But Audubon, he does not feel the same way. It's only 2 months that we are drafting a dissolution to our contract. Since 1806, we have a contract between the two of us that we make all of our decisions unanimously, that we split profits, we split everything 50-50. The contract still exists in the lineage of the Rozier and the Audubon names. But the contract was very clear about that it was a 50-50 partnership. So I am now faced with buying out Audubon. Do I have enough cash to pay for all of it? So I pay him some cash and some in promissory notes until I know I can collect from all of our debtors that owe us money that we have. In any case, only 2 months, April of 1811, Audubon returns back to Henderson, Kentucky, where his wife and child are waiting for him. There's various reasons why he may have left, and not all of it is absolutely 100% certain. But there is some supposition that perhaps someone here in St. Genevieve, particularly a Michel Emeraux, may have certainly recognized, Rozier may have recognized Audubon and knew his story of his illegitimate birth. And Audubon may have been trying to escape that. We certainly were not seeing eye to eye business-wise. And so I saw this as an opportunity to c'est la vie. Let him go, and I will get on with what I came here to do. And I have to say I am quite proud of what the Rozier name has done here in St. Genevieve. My descendants have always all remained, many of them, in the mercantile business trades. And have done well for themselves. Of course, some of them are still living on the profits that I made from that whiskey, because I bought that whiskey at 25 cents a gallon, and we get to St. Genevieve and can sell it for $2 a gallon, a trend that that continues to this day. So anyway, here is an interesting little fact for you. I mentioned the Rozier name as being on Rozier's Country Mart, Rozier's Mattress Store. There was a Rozier's Department Store. There's a Rozier Street. But there is also Audubon this and Audubon that. And he is only here for 2 months. And St. Genevieve adopts him as like a native son and says, Audubon restaurant, Audubon hotel, Audubon estates, Audubon street, Audubon this. My son, Francis, my second oldest son, I had 8 sons and and 2 daughters by my wife, Constance Roy, who I met when I came here. She was 18 years my junior, so she was a healthy woman and able to provide to me many descendants. And my second son, Francis Rozier, carried on my business, mercantile business. He was also county treasurer for St. Genevieve and mayor at one time and held some other posts. He had built a magnificent house down at the northeast corner of what you call Main and Merchant Streets. This is Merchant right here, and Main Street down there. Perhaps you know where the Audubon restaurant is in St. Genevieve. His house was immediately across the street from that in what is now the parking lot. In fact, they tore that house down in the early 1950s to make room for parking for, guess what? The Audubon Hotel. So that is the way life goes. Audubon, of course, he goes on to establish himself as an artist and a drawer.
Was that the same guy?
Exactly. Jean-James Audubon was here in St. Genevieve. And so I suppose that is why we think it is so important to promote his name here in St. Genevieve. We did remain friends, and I did finally pay all my debts to him in the sale of the business. And we continued to correspond throughout our lives. So with our dissolution was not a sad one. Anyone have any questions?
Lieutenant Colonel J. Felix St. James. I was born in St. Genevieve on December 13th, 1831. I am a descendant, I beg your pardon. At the time of my birth, I was born to Augustus and Desiree St. Jim. I took on the name of St. James in the 1850s because I was a lawyer by trade, and I decided I wanted to become run for the Attorney General of Missouri. So in the 1860s, I didn't win, by the way. In 1858, I decided to become a Republican. I had married my wife in 1850. Her name was Suzanne Sargent. Her parents were buried in the cemetery. And so in 1858, when I joined the Republican Party, it was a brand new party at the time. In 1860, I campaigned for a guy named Abraham Lincoln. And I campaigned vigorously for him in St. Genevieve County and attended the National Republican Convention, and he became nominated as a candidate for the presidency of the United States. I came home and campaigned for him in St. Genevieve, and because of my efforts, he received about 4 votes from St. Genevieve for president. So he was not very well thought of in this part of the country in Missouri. So when the war shortly thereafter, the war started, the Civil War did, and then I became a lieutenant colonel in the 13th Missouri Infantry. I was the first man in St. Genevieve County to join the U.S. Army. In 1861, in August 1861, there's a rumor going around that this guy, a Confederate general named Jeff Thompson, who we refer to as the Swamp Fox, had sent out this proclamation, and he said, "Loyal citizens of St. Genevieve and St. Francis County, call to arms. Join me, send me money," just all kinds of stuff. Well, the merchant bank here in town had $58,000 in it. But it was a branch bank of the merchant bank up in St. Louis. So the merchant bank in St. Louis got worried when they heard about this proclamation of General Thompson, and they asked General Fremont to send in some Union soldiers to take the money out and deliver it to them in St. Louis. So General Fremont, he gave orders to the 8th Missouri Infantry, who was in Cape Girardeau at the time, to come up to St. Genevieve and take the money out. And because I was a native of St. Genevieve, he ordered me to come in and act as their guide. So I guided 250 men in the small cannon, and we surrounded the town of St. Genevieve and took the money out of the bank. We then got back on the riverboats and put the money and delivered the money to General Fremont, who then delivered it to the president of the merchant bank. Shortly after that, the 13th Missouri Infantry was ordered to report to General Grant and join his campaigns in the South. Our first battle was the Battle of Fort Donelson, which we played a minor role in that. Then our next battle was called the Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee, our Pittsburgh Landing. It was there on April 6, 1862, the first day of the battle, that I received a mortal wound. And on April the 8th, 1862, I died in the hospital at a small town called Savannah, Tennessee. And then on April the 15th, I was buried next to my father, who had died on March 23rd, 1862. Shortly after that, our son Ichabod, he died and is buried here somewhere. My wife lived, and she died in 1912 and is buried over at the Valley Springs Cemetery. So we're one of those families where one is buried in this cemetery and the other spouse is buried over there. And, after the Civil War, the Grand Army Republic was formed, which was made up of Confederate veterans of the Civil War. I beg your pardon, Union veterans of the Civil War. And they formed a post here in town called the J. Felix St. James Post number 326. Every year on Decoration Day, they would come in and have a ceremony at my tombstone, lay flowers, do the same thing with the veterans here in the cemetery. In 2009, we formed what was called the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, Camp number 326, which I'm a member of. And every year on Memorial Day, we have a ceremony here at his gravesite, and we place flags here and flags at the other Union veterans in the cemetery. Does anybody have any questions? So one thing I want to point out, I just put it in there a while ago. I had a candle burning for a while, but during the Civil War, this is a bayonet. So during the Civil War, the government said that the best use for a bayonet was to stab people with. Right? They would place it on the end of the musket, but the soldiers had a better idea. They would use it as a candle holder. So they would stick the pointed end into the ground and put a candle in the part that went over the barrel of the weapon, and they put the candle there. And they would either read letters from home, write letters home, read local newspapers. And I know it's going to be really, really hard to believe, but at times they would actually gamble by the light of these candles. Thus, I know I was extremely shocked, just like you all are. So does anybody have any questions whatsoever?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
I'm Vital St. Jean Beauvais. My wife is Felicite. Her maiden name is Johnny's. Her father built the Green Tree Tavern. Our house is still standing on Main Street, next to the Show Me Shop. We built the house in 1787, and we moved here about 1787, and we started building the house at that time. We had, I was born in 1739 in Kaskaskia. My wife was born in 1752 in Kaskaskia. We were married in 1775. So my wife was 23, which was getting to be spinsterhood at that time, and I was 36, probably had died in the war bachelor, and may never have changed. But we did have 16 children together, about half of which lived. In 1792, a little boy by the name of Henry Murray Brackenridge came to stay with us. His father was a judge in Pittsburgh, and his father wanted him to learn the French language and French customs, and he sent his son by boat with bargemen down the Ohio River, and when they got to the Mississippi, they came up the Missouri side of the river up to St. Genevieve. We're not sure what the connection was or how it came to be. The little boy's name was Henry Murray Brackenridge, and his father somehow must have known about St. Genevieve or had connections with St. Genevieve to send his son up. Anyway, when he arrived, my wife found out that he had not been baptized, so she immediately marched him up to church and had him baptized because she didn't want this little heathen to be sleeping with her children. Henry lived with us for 3 years, and when he arrived, he didn't know any French, and when he left, he says he had forgotten a good deal of English. But later on in life, he wrote a book about his recollection of people and places, and he spent 6 or 7 pages talking about what it was like living in St. Genevieve for the 3 years he was here. He talks about Mr. Beauvais as having big jowls because he always kept a pipe in his mouth. He talks about Mrs. Beauvais as being rather heavy, large woman who was friendly but stern with the household help. He talks about the food they ate, the garden behind the house, the orchard. He talks about Christmas customs, midnight mass, schooling, dances that they had on Sunday for children, and such things. So it's a very good description of what early life was like in St. Genevieve, things that we wouldn't know about otherwise. Later in life, Henry was coming up from the south, up along the Mississippi River, and he decided to stop in St. Genevieve. And there was nobody at the Valley at the St. Gem house, but there was a party going on at the Valley, Jean-Baptiste Valley house, and so he went down there, and they were having a party for our youngest daughter, Zuzu. And Mrs. Beauvais was so happy to see him. Zuzu was getting married the next day, and so he was here for Zuzu's wedding. I lived to be about 77 years old. My wife lived to be 86 years old.
In 1935,